Imagine this. Two of the most powerful forces in the ancient world are locked in a battle for supremacy, fighting on land and sea in a clash that would change history forever. For 23 years, Rome and Carthage fought with everything they had, inventing new strategies, building massive fleets, and enduring endless battles. Welcome to the First Punic War, the war that shaped the future of the Mediterranean. Let's rewind to 264 BCE. The Mediterranean was the center of the ancient world. Whoever controlled its waters controlled trade, wealth, and power. On one side of this rivalry was Rome, a growing republic in Italy with an unstoppable army. On the other side was Carthage, a rich city state on the North African coast whose navy ruled the waves. At first glance, these two powers couldn't have been more different. Rome was a land based power with disciplined armies and an obsession with expanding its borders. Carthage, on the other hand, was a seafaring empire. Its massive fleet protected its trade routes and brought wealth from across the Mediterranean. The conflict began over a seemingly small issue: control of the island of Sicily. This strategic island was the perfect staging ground for controlling trade between Europe and Africa. Both Rome and Carthage wanted it, and neither side was willing to back down. What started as a small conflict on Sicily quickly escalated into one of the longest and most grueling wars in history. The main case: Rome. The Roman Republic was a powerhouse on land. Its legions were made up of citizens who trained to fight with precision and discipline. But while their soldiers were second to none, Rome had a major weakness. It didn't have a navy. They relied on their allies for seafaring, and compared to Carthage, they were amateurs at naval warfare. Carthage. Carthage, on the other hand, was a maritime superpower. The quinqueremes, warships with 5 rows of oars, dominated the seas. Carthage had years of experience as traders and sailors, and their wealth allowed them to hire mercenaries to fight on land. However, their government wasn't as unified as Rome's, which often led to disagreements during wartime. Rome's strength was in its relentless determination. Carthage's strength lay in its mastery of the sea. These differences would define the First Punic War. Key events and battles that took place in the First Punic War. The Siege of Messana. The war's origins trace back to the Sicilian triumph of Messana. This small but strategically located city became the focal point of a bitter rivalry. Messana sat at the northeastern tip of Sicily, controlling a narrow strait that was vital for trade and military movements. At the time, Messana was under the control of a group of mercenaries called the Mamertines. These men were former soldiers who had taken over the city and ruled it with force. However, their power was under threat from two sides. The Greek city-state of Syracuse, led by King Hiero II, wanted to capture Messana and bring it under their control. At the same time, Carthage saw an opportunity to expand its influence and protect its trade routes by taking Messana. Feeling trapped, the Mamertines reached out to both Rome and Carthage for help. This decision was like poking a hornet's nest. Carthage was quick to find forces to Messana, establishing a garrison in the city. Rome, on the other hand, hesitated. Some Roman leaders didn't want to get involved in a conflict so far from home, especially since it could mean war with Carthage. However, Rome eventually decided to act. The fear that allowing Carthage to control Messana would give them too much power in Sicily and threaten Rome's growing influence in southern Italy. Roman troops crossed the sea and entered Messana, forcing the Carthaginian garrison to withdraw. This move infuriated Carthage, and they quickly declared war. The siege of Messana marked the start of open hostilities between Rome and Carthage, dragging both powers into a larger conflict. What began as a local dispute over a small city would soon become a full-scale war, including thousands of sailors and soldiers. When the war began, Rome was at significant disadvantage. The legions were unmatched on land, but the Mediterranean was Carthage's territory. The Carthaginian navy roamed the seas, and without a fleet, Rome could not effectively challenge them. But the Romans weren't the type to give up easily. They decided to build a navy from scratch. a daring and ambitious move. To speed up the process, they captured a Carthaginian quinquereme that had run aground and used it as a blueprint. This ship, with its rows of oars, was the backbone of Carthage's navy, and Rome planned to use it against them. Building the ships was only half the battle. The Romans now faced another challenge. They didn't know how to sail. To train their crews, they practiced rowing on dry land using mock ships set up on the shore. This gave the rowers and marines a basic understanding of how to work together. The Romans also added their own innovation, the corvus or crow. This was a birding plank with a large spike on the end. During a battle, the corvus could be swung onto an enemy ship where it would latch on like a giant claw. Battle of Mylae. With their newly built navy, Rome faced its first major test at the Battle of Mylae. This battle took place off the northern coast of Sicily and was a defining moment in the war. The Carthaginian fleet, confident in their naval superiority, approached Mylae expecting an easy victory. They had over 100 warships compared to Rome's fleet of about the same size, but they underestimated Rome's determination and ingenuity. As the battle began, the Romans used their corvus to devastating effect. When the Carthaginian ships tried to ram them, the Romans dropped the corvus onto the army decks, turning the sea into a chaotic battlefield. Carthaginian sailors used to quick naval engagements found themselves outmatched in close combat by Roman soldiers. Rome's commander Gaius Julius led the fleet with courage and skill. Under his leadership, the Romans captured or sank over 50 Carthaginian ships, a staggering victory for a navy that hadn't existed just a few years earlier. The Battle of Mylae was a turning point. It proved that Rome could challenge Carthage at sea and boosted Roman morale. Julius was awarded a triumph, and a column decorated with the bronze rams of captured Carthaginian ships was erected in his honor. The invasion of Africa. After their successes in Sicily, Rome decided to strike directly at the heart of Carthage. The plan was bold: launch an invasion of North Africa to force Carthage into surrender. In 256 BCE, a massive Roman fleet set sail, carrying tens of thousands of soldiers under the command of Marcus Atilius Regulus. After a dramatic naval victory at Cape Economus, one of the biggest sea battles in history, the Romans landed on the shores of North Africa. At first, the invasion went well. The Roman legions defeated Carthaginian forces in a series of battles and advanced towards Carthage itself. The Carthaginians were caught off guard and desperate to stop the Romans. But Rome's luck didn't last. The Carthaginians hired Xanthippus, a skilled Greek mercenary commander, to reorganize their army. Xanthippus brought discipline and strategy to the Carthaginian forces, and he knew exactly how to exploit Rome's weaknesses. In 255 BCE, the two sides clashed in a decisive battle. Xanthippus used war elephants to break the Roman lines and cavalry to outflank their forces. The Roman army was crushed, with thousands killed or captured. Regulus himself was taken prisoner and later died in captivity, becoming a symbol of Roman heroism and sacrifice. The invasion of Africa was a costly failure for Rome, but it didn't break their spirit. They regrouped and continued the fight in Sicily, determined to achieve victory. The Battle of Aegates Islands, 241 BCE. After years of brutal fighting, the war finally came to a climactic end at the Aegates Islands. Rome, having rebuilt its navy yet again, launched a surprise attack on the Carthaginian fleet. Despite being outnumbered, the Roman ships were lighter and faster, allowing them to outmaneuver the Carthaginians. Rome's victory at sea forced Carthage to surrender. After 23 years of war, Rome emerged as the new dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. The First Punic War was a turning point in history. For Rome, this was the first step in Rome's transformation from a regional power to a global empire. By winning Sicily, they gained their first province outside Italy. More importantly, they proved they could adapt to new challenges like naval warfare. For Carthage, the war was a devastating blow. They lost control of Sicily, their navy was severely weakened, and they were forced to pay a massive indemnity to Rome. However, Carthage wasn't finished yet. This defeat planted the seeds for the Second Punic War, where they would seek revenge under the leadership of the brilliant general Hannibal. The First Punic War taught the world several lessons. Adaptability wins wars. Rome's ability to build a navy from scratch and innovate with the corvus was a game changer. War has a heavy price. The war was one of the costliest in ancient history. Thousands of lives were lost, cities were destroyed, and entire economies were drained. It was a stark reminder of the human and financial toll of prolonged conflict. Rivalries shape history. The rivalry between Rome and Carthage didn't end with the First Punic War. It set the stage for even greater conflicts, including Hannibal's legendary campaign during the Second Punic War. This war marked the beginning of Rome's rise as a superpower. It showed the importance of perseverance, innovation, and strategic thinking, qualities that are still valuable today. The conflict also highlights the dangers of unending rivalries and the cost of war, lessons that resonate even in modern times. Most importantly, the First Punic War reminds us of the resilience of the human spirit. Both Rome and Carthage faced incredible challenges, but they kept fighting for what they believed in. This story inspires us to stay determined no matter the odds. The First Punic War was just the opening act in a much larger drama. The rivalry between Rome and Carthage would continue to shape the ancient world, leading to epic stories of heroism, strategy, and survival. And who knows, perhaps this tale of resilience and rivalry will inspire you to face your own challenges with the same determination that Rome and Carthage showed up so long ago. Stay curious and remember, history isn't just about the past, it's a guide for the future.
Imagine you're a Roman soldier. The sun burns your back, sweat stings your eyes, and in front of you, chaos. A sea of enemy warriors closing in, their weapons flashing in the unforgiving sunlight, their war cries chilling your blood. But they are not just any warriors. No, they are led by the most feared commander of the ancient world, Hannibal Barca. Suddenly the earth trembles. No, not an earthquake. Something worse. A deep, thunderous rumble. You feel it before you see it. Then, out of the dust, they emerge. Giant war elephants, their ivory tusks gleaming, their sheer size sending fear coursing through your veins. They charge straight at you, crushing men and shields alike under their massive weight. This is not a nightmare. This is real. This is the Second Punic War, the war that nearly destroyed Rome. But how did it come to this? How did one man almost bring the mighty Roman Republic to its knees? And most importantly, why does it still matter today? Buckle up, because this is one of the greatest war stories in history. Before we dive into the action, let's go back to the beginning. Two great powers ruled the Mediterranean, Rome and Carthage. Rome, the rising superpower of Italy, known for its disciplined legions and relentless ambition. Carthage, a wealthy and powerful city in North Africa, a thriving trade hub with a navy that ruled the seas. They had already fought one war, the First Punic War. Rome won, but Carthage never forgot the humiliation. And in Carthage, a young boy named Hannibal stood before his father, his small hands clenched into fists as he swore a blood oath, an oath to destroy Rome. Fast forward a few decades, and Hannibal was ready to keep his promise. He didn't just want to fight Rome, he wanted to crush it. If you were Hannibal, how would you attack Rome? Would you A. build a huge navy and invade by sea? B. march straight through enemy territory? C. try something crazy that no one would expect? The answer: crazy something, something no one expected. Hannibal decided to march his entire army, including war elephants, through the Alps. It was one of the most daring moves in military history. Hannibal and his army, 40,000 men, thousands of horses, and 37 war elephants, began the impossible journey across the Alps. Freezing temperatures, starvation, avalanche after avalanche. They battled not just the elements, but hostile mountain tribes attacking from above. The narrow paths crumbled beneath their feet. Thousands died. But Hannibal pushed on. And when they finally emerged, they weren't just alive, they were ready for war. And that's when the Romans got the news. Hannibal had arrived from the north. Rome had never expected an attack from the north. And that's exactly what Hannibal wanted. Then came the moment that sent shockwaves through history. The Battle of Cannae. Hannibal faced a Roman army twice the size of his own. The Romans thought they had him trapped. They charged in full force, believing their numbers alone would secure victory. But Hannibal had a plan. He let the Romans push forward, then, boom, his cavalry slammed into their sides. The crescent formation closed like a vice, surrounding the Romans completely. They were trapped. The result? A massacre. 50,000 Roman soldiers fell that day. Some say the rivers ran, red with blood. Rome had never suffered a defeat like this before. Panic spread. People thought it was over, that Rome would fall. If you were a Roman leader after this disaster, what would you do? Would you A. surrender to Hannibal? B. fight harder no matter the cost? C. build a time machine and try again? Just kidding, that wasn't an option. The Romans? They chose B. fight harder. But this time they fought smarter. Scipio Africanus, Rome's answer to Hannibal. He realized something important. Instead of chasing Hannibal around Italy, he'd attack Carthage itself. If Carthage was in danger, Hannibal would have to come back and defend it, and it worked. Hannibal was forced to return home. And that set the stage for one final epic showdown. This was it, the final battle. Rome versus Carthage. Scipio versus Hannibal, two of the greatest military minds in history. But Rome had learned from its mistakes. Scipio had a trick up his sleeve. As the elephants charged, the Roman soldiers opened gaping pathways, letting them pass harmlessly through. Then the Romans counterattacked. And just like that, it was over. Hannibal was defeated. Carthage surrendered. The war was over. The Second Punic War changed history forever. Rome survived its darkest hour. And because of this victory, it would go on to build one of the greatest empires the world has ever seen. But what about Hannibal? He never stopped fighting, always on the run, until he took his own life rather than be captured. His name still echoes through history as one of the greatest military minds of all time. If you want more epic history stories, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. What other battles should we cover next? Let us know in the comments.
The final showdown between Rome and Carthage. Imagine a city so rich that its people decorated their temples with gold and silver. A city so powerful, it once controlled the Mediterranean Sea. Now imagine that same city being burned to the ground, its people taken away as slaves, and its name erased from history books for years. That's the story of the Third Punic War, the final and most brutal conflict between two ancient superpowers, Rome and Carthage. For over a century, Rome and Carthage were fighting on control over trade, land, and power in the Mediterranean. They had already fought two massive wars before. The First Punic War, 264 to 241 BCE, was a fight over who would rule the island of Sicily, and the Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BCE, saw Carthage's famous general Hannibal almost defeat Rome. But even after two wars, these ancient powerhouses couldn't let it go. Rome was paranoid. They believed Carthage was still a threat, even though Carthage had been humiliated after losing the Second Punic War. Rome had forced Carthage to pay a huge fine, give up its navy, and promise never to fight another war without Rome's permission. Still, Carthage managed to bounce back. The city became wealthy again, focusing on trade instead of war. But Rome wasn't happy. They saw Carthage's growing wealth as a sign of danger. But by the end of 149 BC, their deadly game would come to its final, disastrous conclusion. The legacy of Hannibal, a shadow over Rome. Before we dive into the Third Punic War itself, we need to understand the deep-rooted fears that pushed Rome to launch this devastating conflict. These fears were born out of the harrowing experiences of the Second Punic War, fought between 218 and 201 BC. The Second Punic War is famous for one reason: Hannibal Barca. This Carthaginian general, one of the greatest military tacticians in history, became the living embodiment of Rome's deepest fears. Hannibal's invasion of Italy is still considered one of the most remarkable military campaigns in history. In 218 BC, Hannibal led his army, including war elephants, across the Alps into Italy, an unimaginable feat at the time. Over the next few years, Hannibal's forces would strike fear into the hearts of every Roman citizen. His victory at the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC was a crushing blow to the Roman Republic. Out of an army of around 80,000 men, nearly 70,000 Roman soldiers were slaughtered in a single day. This disaster was so devastating that it threatened to unravel the entire Roman Republic. But despite these crushing defeats, the Romans were not defeated. In a remarkable display of resilience, Rome rebuilt its army and, under the leadership of General Scipio Africanus, eventually managed to turn the tide of the war. In 202 BC, Scipio's forces defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama, forcing Carthage to surrender. However, even though Carthage lost the Second Punic War, The trauma of Hannibal's invasion was etched deeply into Roman memory. The Romans could never forget how close they came to being defeated by the Carthaginian general. His name became synonymous with fear, and the idea that Carthage could rise again to challenge Rome haunted the Roman psyche for generations. The survival of Carthage, a resurgence that couldn't be ignored. While Rome celebrated its victory in the Second Punic War, Carthage, though battered and broken, survived. The peace treaty that ended the war left Carthage severely weakened. The city was forced to pay a hefty indemnity, reduce its military to a fraction of its former size, and surrender its overseas possessions. Carthage was no longer the dominant naval and trading power it once had been. However, despite these harsh terms, Carthage did not simply disappear into history. The city began to rebuild, and by the late 2nd century BC, it had regained some of its former wealth. Trade flourished once more, and its merchants were once again conducting business across the Mediterranean. But for many Romans, this revival of Carthage was a source of deep concern. The idea that Carthage, despite its earlier defeat, could recover and once again pose a threat to Rome was deeply unsettling. The fear of Carthage's resurgence, particularly among the Roman elite, became one of the driving forces behind the decision to go to war once again. Rome's leaders, haunted by the memory of Hannibal, feared that if left unchecked, Carthage could rebuild its power and challenge Roman supremacy once again. Rome's political elite, including figures such as Cato the Elder, began to push for drastic action. Cato, who had seen the devastation wrought by Hannibal's invasion, became a staunch advocate for the total destruction of Carthage. In every speech he made in the Senate, Cato would famously end with the words, "Carthage must be destroyed." These words echoed throughout Roman political circles, stirring the public spheres and pushing for a final, all-out war. The catalyst, Rome and Numidia. In 150 BC, an event provided the perfect excuse for Rome to act. Carthage found itself at odds with its neighbor, the Kingdom of Numidia, a client kingdom of Rome. The Numidian king, Massinissa, had been encroaching on Carthaginian territory. Carthage, desperate to protect its borders, took military action. This move, though driven by defensive concerns, was seen by the Romans as a violation of the peace treaty that had been signed after the Second Punic War. Rome's reaction was swift and harsh. Rome demanded that Carthage disarm and dismantle its city defenses. Impossible demands that left the Carthaginians with little choice but to resist. At this point, the political climate in Rome was strongly anti-Carthaginian. The Senate, influenced by Cato's rhetoric and the fear of Carthage's resurgence, was determined to eliminate the threat once and for all. Rome, in its eyes, had no choice but to act decisively. The war was inevitable. Carthage's resistance and the siege begins. The Carthaginians, knowing that Rome would not back down, made their final stand. The city of Carthage was well fortified, with high walls and a strong defensive position. However, it was not only the walls that the Romans would have to overcome, it was the will of the Carthaginian people to survive. Despite their weakened state, Carthage's leaders and citizens were determined to protect their home from the Roman threat. The Roman army, led by Scipio Aemilianus, was a seasoned and formidable force. It consisted of both Roman soldiers and mercenaries, including troops from Rome's allies, which was crucial for the long and costly siege that lay ahead. Initially, the Romans set up their camp outside the city's strong walls, intending to block any escape and prevent Carthage from receiving supplies or reinforcements. The Carthaginians began to prepare for the worst. They fortified their defenses, mobilized their forces, and attempted to rally their people. The leader of Carthage, Hasdrubal, took command of the defense, knowing that the city's survival depended on his ability to hold off the Roman legions. Hasdrubal, though not as famous as Hannibal, was a skilled commander in his own right. However, Despite his best efforts, the Carthaginian forces were no match for the overwhelming power of Rome. In 149 BC, the Romans began their siege of Carthage. As the siege began, the Romans quickly established a blockade around Carthage. They cut off trade routes and intercepted supplies from the rest of North Africa. But this did not immediately bring Carthage to its knees. The Carthaginians proved resourceful and resilient, continuing to fight back. For the Romans, the siege was more than just a military operation. It was a test of endurance and patience. Despite the blockade, Carthage remained steadfast, and the siege continued into the second year, with both sides preparing for a prolonged struggle. The Carthaginian military, though weakened from previous wars, still managed to put up fierce resistance, using their naval fleet and internal defenses to maintain control of key sections of the city. The Carthaginian navy, while not as large as it once had been, still played a significant role in defending their coastlines, even though it was mostly confined to the city's harbor. The Romans, who were not only aiming to starve the city into submission, but also seeking to destroy its power, launched repeated raids on Carthaginian positions. However, Carthage continued to rebuild its defenses and make use of its formidable defenses. After a prolonged period of blockade and skirmishes, the Romans began a full siege of Carthage in 147 BC. The Romans constructed siege walls around the city to trap the defenders inside. This wall effectively isolated Carthage, leaving the defenders with limited options. The Carthaginians tried several times to break through the siege lines, but these attempts were repelled by the Romans. The Romans began building siege towers, battering rams, and other machinery in an attempt to breach Carthage's thick walls. They also constructed a series of trenches to help protect their own soldiers from the Carthaginian attacks. Despite this, Carthage still held out, and the situation became even more dire for the Romans, who suffered both from exhaustion and the harsh conditions surrounding the siege. As the siege wore on, the Romans began to face their own difficulties. Supplies were strained, and some soldiers became disillusioned by the protracted battle. However, the Romans had learned from previous sieges and had mastered the art of maintaining long-term campaigns. They were able to draw upon their allies in Numidia and other parts of North Africa, ensuring that they could maintain a steady supply of food and reinforcements. Carthage was not without its options for defending itself. Despite being heavily besieged, the Carthaginians made repeated efforts to counterattack. They used their remaining warships to launch raids on Roman supply lines, and even attempted to break through the Roman blockade. On a few occasions, the Carthaginians succeeded in damaging Roman forces, particularly in their attempts to fight back at the blockade on land. Despite these efforts, Carthage's resources were being drained faster than they could replenish them. The city's food stores were dwindling, and morale was sinking. The Romans, on the other hand, were increasingly able to cut off vital resources and press the siege even harder. The fall of Carthage, the final assault. By 146 BC, the Romans had gathered enough strength to launch a full assault on the city. The siege had dragged on for years, but the Carthaginians' resolve had not faltered. The city's defenders fought with everything they had, but their efforts were in vain. The Romans, led by Scipio Aemilianus, the grandson of Scipio Africanus, pressed forward with ruthless determination. The final assault on the city was brutal, with house-to-house fighting that turned the streets of Carthage into a battlefield. Carthage, once a proud and powerful empire, was no more. The lasting impact of the Third Punic War. For Rome, the victory in the Third Punic War solidified its position as the dominant power in the Mediterranean. With Carthage destroyed, Rome was free to expand its influence even further. The war also marked the beginning of a new phase of Roman imperialism, as the Republic transitioned toward becoming an empire. For the people of Carthage, the Third Punic War was the final chapter in their city's long and storied history. They had fought with courage, but ultimately, their defeat signaled the end of their empire.